December 22nd, 1978. The town of Shakhty in the Rostov Oblast of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. A coal mining town. Industrial, gray, functional. The kind of place that exists to extract something from the earth and does not apologize for the extraction. It is cold. Not poetically cold, not the cold of a story that wants you to feel something. Practically cold. The temperature in the Rostov Oblast in late December sits well below freezing, and the wind that comes off the Don steppe does not negotiate. There is a little girl at an ice skating rink. Her name is Yelena Zakotnova. She is 9 years old. She loves ice skating. This is not a minor detail. It is the detail that explains why she is here, at this rink, on this particular evening, when the cold would have kept most children inside. She has been here for hours. She is the kind of child who loses track of time when she is doing something she loves, who has to be reminded that dinner exists, that it is getting dark, that the rink will close. The rink is closing now. She laces up her boots and steps outside. The street is quiet in the way that Soviet industrial towns are quiet in winter. Not peaceful, just empty. The light is the low orange of a sun that has already given up and gone below the horizon. The cold hits her face immediately. She begins to walk home. She is wearing her coat. It is a good coat. Warm, well-made relative to what most families in Shakhty could afford. Her parents had saved for it. It is the kind of coat that a 9-year-old wears with the unself-consciousness of someone who does not yet know that clothing can be a statement of anything other than warmth. The street she takes home passes near the edge of a residential block. There are fences here, small yards, the compressed geometry of Soviet working-class housing. She has walked this route before. She knows it. A man falls into step beside her. He is tall, thin. He wears thick glasses, the kind that make the eyes behind them look slightly larger than they are, slightly more intent. He is carrying a briefcase. He looks, to a 9-year-old girl in 1978 in a Soviet coal mining town, like a teacher, like an official. Like an adult who belongs in the world of adults, and therefore poses no threat to a child. He speaks to her. He says he has something to show her. Toys, perhaps. The accounts differ slightly on exactly what he offered. Something a child would want to see. She goes with him. The house was close. He had chosen it specifically for that. For the proximity to the places where children moved, for the quiet of the street around it, for the key in his pocket that he had cut himself and told no one about. He unlocked the door. She went inside. What happened in that house on the evening of December 22nd, 1978, Chikatilo described in detail during his 1990 confession. We will not reproduce those details here. What matters for this story, what the record requires us to say, is this: he had not planned to kill her. That is not a defense. It is a fact that the psychiatrists who later evaluated him confirmed, and it matters because it tells us something important about what he was and how he worked. He had gone to that house with a different intention. A predatory intention, yes, a monstrous one, but not murder. What triggered the killing was her resistance, her noise, the possibility that she would be heard. And in the moment of silencing her, in the specific physical act of stopping her from being able to make sound, something happened in his body that had never happened before in his adult life. Something that 12 years of marriage, 12 years of quiet domestic failure, 12 years of the particular private humiliation of a man whose body would not cooperate with his own desire. Something that none of that had ever produced. He experienced for the first time a complete sexual response. Not to her, not to anything human or relatable, to the act itself, to the absolute, total, irrevocable power of the moment, to the silence he had created where there had been noise. When it was over, he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just discovered something terrible about himself, that he would do this again. Yelena Zakotnova was 9 years old. She had been at the ice skating rink because she loved to skate. Her body was found 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, beneath a bridge over the Grushevka River. She had been thrown from the bridge into the water below. The river was not fully frozen. It took her. Her parents reported her missing on the evening of December 22nd, when she did not come home from the rink. They spent the night waiting. This is one of the details about this case that the records preserve, and that no amount of distance makes easier to read. The particular texture of a night spent waiting for a child who is not coming home. The way time moves differently in that kind of waiting. The way every sound from outside becomes a possible answer. In the morning, the Shakhty militia began a search. On December 24th, 2 days after her disappearance, a resident of the district noticed something in the Grushevka River. The water was moving, barely, sluggishly, the river fighting the cold. And moving with it was something that should not have been there. They pulled her out. The autopsy recorded stab wounds to the abdomen, 3 of them, deep enough to have caused catastrophic internal bleeding. She had been strangled into unconsciousness before the stabbing. The pathologist's assessment was that she had not been conscious when she died, which is the kind of detail that a family holds on to in the dark for the rest of their lives, because it is the only mercy available. Near the water's edge, investigators found her backpack, and nearby, close enough to matter, not close enough to be proof of anything the law would recognize, investigators noted the proximity of a small, privately owned house. The house had a new owner. His name was in the registry. He had purchased it recently. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. An investigator knocked on his door. Chikatilo answered, calm and cooperative. He said he knew nothing. He said he had been at home with his family on the evening of the 22nd. He said he was sorry about the girl. He was noted in the file. He was not arrested. He went back inside. He closed the door. The Shakhty militia needed to close this case. We need to understand what that sentence meant in the Soviet Union in 1978, because it meant something very specific. It did not mean, find the person responsible. It meant, produce a conviction. The performance metric of Soviet law enforcement was the closure rate, the percentage of cases that ended with a guilty verdict. An open case was an embarrassment. An unsolved child murder was a potential scandal, the kind that could travel up the chain of command and find its way to regional party officials who would want to know why their district was producing dead children and no answers. The militia needed a name on a piece of paper. Quickly, they found one. His name was Aleksandr Kravchenko. He was 25 years old. He worked as a laborer in Shakhty. He had a prior conviction from his youth, a serious one, for rape and murder, for which he had served time and been released. In the logic of Soviet policing, this made him the answer to the question the militia needed answered. He had done something like this before. He lived nearby. He was exactly the kind of man who could be made to fit. They arrested him. His alibi was immediate and solid. He had been at home on the evening of December 22nd. His wife confirmed it. A neighbor who had been present confirmed it. He had not left the apartment. 3 people placed him there at the time of Yelena Zakotnova's disappearance. The militia noted the alibi. Then, they went to work on the witnesses. Kravchenko's wife was brought in for questioning. Her name does not appear in the public record. She is referred to in documents only by relation to her husband. She was young. She was frightened. She was sitting in a room with men who had the full authority of the Soviet state behind them, and those men explained to her, carefully and without raising their voices, what would happen if she continued to maintain her account of the evening of December 22nd. She would be charged as an accomplice. She would be tried. She would go to prison. Her life, as she knew it, would be finished. All she had to do, the only thing standing between her and that outcome, was to say that she had been wrong about the time, that her husband had come home later than she remembered, that she could not, in fact, be certain he had been there all evening. She held out for as long as she could. Then she signed a revised statement. The neighbor was brought in next. The same explanation was given. The same alternative was offered. The neighbor, who had a family, who had a job, who had a life that depended on not being in conflict with the Soviet state, revised their account as well. With the alibi dismantled, Kravchenko was subjected to interrogation. The interrogation methods employed by the Soviet militia in cases of this kind are documented in human rights records and in the accounts of survivors. They involved sleep deprivation. They involved sustained physical pressure. They involved the particular psychological technique of presenting a man with evidence, manufactured or selectively assembled, that made his own memory of events seem unreliable, seemed to suggest that perhaps he had done something he could not fully remember. Kravchenko maintained his innocence. He maintained it for as long as he was able. And then, in the way that a person eventually stops being able to hold something that is too heavy, he stopped. He signed the confession that the militia had prepared for him. He put his name at the bottom of a document that said he had murdered Yelena Zakotnova. He had not murdered Yelena Zakotnova. The trial of Aleksandr Kravchenko opened in 1979. On the first day of proceedings, Kravchenko stood up in the courtroom and retracted his confession. He said clearly, in front of the judge and the prosecution and the gallery, that he had not committed this crime, that the confession had been produced under duress, that he had been beaten, that the witnesses against him had been threatened into changing their accounts. He said all of this. It was noted in the record. He was convicted anyway. The evidence against him was a confession he had retracted, testimony from witnesses who had changed their original accounts under pressure, and blood found on his wife's sweater, blood that matched both the victim's type and his wife's own blood type, a fact the prosecution did not dwell on. The evidence in his favor was the original testimony of 3 people who had placed him at home all evening, his own consistent denial from the moment of arrest, and the absence of any physical evidence placing him at the scene. He was sentenced to death. In December 1980, the Supreme Court reviewed the case. They commuted the sentence. 15 years in a labor camp instead of execution. This was presented as mercy. It was not mercy. It was a delay. Because the family of Yelena Zakotnova had not accepted the commutation. They had watched this man be convicted of murdering their daughter, and then they had watched the state step back from the ultimate consequence. And the grief of parents who have lost a child to violence does not accommodate nuance well. They wanted the sentence carried out. They pushed. They wrote letters. They made noise in the places where Soviet citizens could make noise without being arrested for it. The state listened. In 1982, the case was retried. The Supreme Court, responding to public pressure from the victim's family and from local party officials who wanted the matter resolved, reinstated the death penalty. Aleksandr Kravchenko was informed of the new sentence. He was 29 years old by this time. He had spent 3 years in a labor camp for a murder he had not committed, maintaining through all of it that he was innocent, writing appeals, sending letters, insisting to anyone who would listen that the real killer was still free. Nobody listened. On a morning in July 1983, Aleksandr Kravchenko was taken from his cell and led down a corridor. The Soviet method of execution was a single shot to the back of the head, fired at close range. It was considered by the state to be efficient and humane. It was carried out in a basement room. Aleksandr Kravchenko was executed for the murder of Yelena Zakotnova in July 1983. His name was removed from the labor camp rolls. A notation was made in the file. The case was closed. The real killer was, at that moment, actively hunting. He had murdered at least 6 people since Yelena Zakotnova. He would murder 45 more. We need to pause here and sit with what just happened. Because what happened was not a mistake. Or rather, it was a series of deliberate choices made by people who knew what they were doing that produced an outcome those people preferred to the alternative. The alternative was uncertainty. The alternative was an open case, an unsolved murder, a file that sat on a desk and reminded everyone above it that the Shakhty militia had a dead child and no answer. The alternative was the possibility that the real killer might be harder to find, that he might require more resources, more time, more of the kind of honest investigative work that the Soviet system was not designed to reward. Closing the case on Kravchenko was easier. It was faster. It produced the conviction rate number that the system required. It answered the family's grief with something that looked, from the outside, like justice. And it left the real killer free. This is not an accident of history. It is not a failure of individuals who were otherwise well-intentioned. It is the logical outcome of a system that measured success by the wrong thing, that counted convictions instead of truth, that prioritized the appearance of order over the reality of it, that built into its own foundation the conditions under which an innocent man could be executed and a guilty one could walk away. That system did not change because Kravchenko died. It continued. It would continue for another 11 years, hampering the investigation at every turn, allowing Chikatilo to move through it like water through a net. He knew the net had holes. He had learned, in December 1978, that the holes were large enough to step through. He stepped through them, again and again, for 12 years. Between the execution of Kravchenko in July 1983 and his own arrest in November 1990, Andrei Chikatilo murdered 45 people. We are going to account for that period, the full 12 years from the first murder to the last, across the remaining parts of this series. But before we leave part 2, we need to establish something about how he operated, because understanding the method is what makes the investigation comprehensible. It is what makes the failures comprehensible. It is what explains how a man could kill 52 people across 3 Soviet republics and remain invisible for over a decade. He traveled for work. This is the foundation of everything. In the years following the Zakotnova murder, Chikatilo had moved away from teaching, not entirely voluntarily. The complaints from school dormitories had accumulated to the point where the path of least resistance was to leave education. He found work as a supply clerk for an industrial firm. The job required him to travel, to take trains and buses between towns and cities across the Rostov Oblast and beyond. He carried paperwork. He had legitimate reasons to be on platforms, in waiting rooms, in the transit hubs where people gathered, and where, crucially, many of the people who gathered were transient. Runaways, young people who had left their villages for the cities and not quite arrived anywhere. People who were in the system loosely, or not at all, whose absence would not immediately generate a missing person report, whose disappearance might be attributed to the ordinary drift of Soviet youth looking for something better somewhere else. He looked for them. He found them. He was patient, and he was quiet, and he looked, to everyone around him on those platforms, like exactly what he was: a middle-aged Soviet clerk with a briefcase, waiting for his train. The forest strips. In Russian, the word is lesopolosa. It translates, approximately, as forest strip. The narrow bands of trees planted alongside railway lines and highway corridors across the Soviet steppe, originally intended as windbreaks, as modest ecological interruptions in the vast flatness of the southern Russian landscape. From the platform of any rural station in the Rostov Oblast, you could see them. Dark lines of trees running parallel to the tracks, close enough to reach on foot in 5 minutes, dense enough, once you were inside them, to become invisible to anyone on the platform you had just left. Chikatilo understood these places with the intimate knowledge of someone who had spent a childhood hiding in the margins, in ditches, in cellars, in the spaces between things. He understood that they were transitional spaces, neither here nor there, not claimed by any particular community or jurisdiction. He understood that what happened in them was unlikely to be witnessed, and that the witnesses who might exist, the occasional hiker, the child taking a shortcut, were easy to avoid if you chose your moments carefully. He chose his moments carefully. The pattern that would emerge across 12 years of murders was consistent enough that it eventually acquired a name in the investigation. Burakov and his team called it the Lesopolosa method, an approach made on a platform or in a waiting room, an offer of help with directions, of vodka, of a trade, of some small thing that a child or a desperate young woman might want. A walk together toward the trees, and then the forest and the silence. The bodies were found by mushroom pickers, by children playing, by dogs following a scent, by the ordinary accident of people moving through landscape that had been made terrible without their knowledge. Each body found was a discovery that the investigation had failed again. Each body found meant another family sitting in a waiting room, being told that the person they were waiting for was not coming back. By the time Viktor Burakov took formal control of the investigation in the mid-1980s, there were dozens of red pins in the map of the Rostov Oblast. Each pin was a body. Each body had a name. Each name had a family. Burakov is a figure we will spend considerable time with in Part 3, because his story runs alongside Chikatilo's for the back half of this series, and because he represents something that the Soviet system was not supposed to produce. An investigator who was willing to be wrong, willing to abandon assumptions, willing to look at the evidence and follow it, rather than follow the conclusion the system wanted him to reach. But in 1978, in the weeks after Yelena Zakotnova's murder, Burakov was not yet on this case. The Shakhty militia had closed it. Kravchenko was in custody. The file had a name on it, and the system was satisfied. Chikatilo knew that the name on the file was not his. He knew that the man who had been convicted of killing Yelena Zakotnova was not him, and that the system that had produced that conviction believed its own conclusion, and that there was therefore nothing pointing in his direction. He waited. 3 years passed after the Zakotnova murder in which he did not kill. Whether from caution, from fear, from something else that the psychiatric record does not entirely clarify, we cannot say with certainty. 3 years of ordinary life, work, home, faina, the briefcase, the commute, the quiet evenings in a Soviet apartment where nothing unusual happened and nothing unusual was visible to anyone watching. Then, in September 1981, the waiting ended. On September 3, 1981, a 17-year-old girl named Larissa Tkachenko was waiting at a rural bus stop in the Rostov area. She was a boarding school student trying to get back to her school after a visit. The bus was late. The stop was not busy. The evening was warm. Chikatilo approached her. He offered to buy her vodka. He knew, by this point in his life, something about the social geometry of a lonely young person waiting for a bus at the end of a long day. He knew that the offer of something small and warm and immediate was often enough. That loneliness is a solvent. That a person who has been alone with their own thoughts for an hour, waiting for transport that isn't coming, can be made to agree to things they might otherwise refuse, simply because agreeing means not being alone anymore. She agreed. They walked together toward the tree line. Larissa Tkachenko's body was found near the Don River. She had been strangled. Chikatilo had forced mud and leaves into her throat, a method of silencing that he would refine and repeat, that the pathologists who eventually cataloged his methods would identify as a signature. She was 17 years old. She had been waiting for a bus. Her parents, in the weeks that followed her disappearance, were subjected to surveillance by the local militia, who operated on the assumption that murders of this kind were crimes of passion committed by people who knew the victim. Her classmates were questioned. Her friends were questioned. The investigation looked, as Soviet investigations typically looked, inward, at the world immediately surrounding the victim, and found nothing, because the answer was not there. The answer was on a train platform, in a gray coat, carrying a briefcase, watching the departures board. Between September 1981 and September 1984, Chikatilo murdered at least 22 people, women and girls mostly, but not only. Among the dead were boys, young, transient, unattended boys, who had wandered into the wrong station at the wrong time, who had accepted help from a stranger who seemed to know where he was going. Igor Gudkov was 7 years old. Sergei Kuzmin was 15. Dmitry Ptashnikov was 10 and loved stamps, and went to a kiosk one afternoon to trade and never came back. We will spend time with each of them in part 3. For now, we leave part 2 here, at the moment when the investigation is still looking in the wrong direction, still operating on the assumption that the murderer is somewhere inside the social world of his victims, still without a profile, without a method, without the conceptual framework that would eventually allow Viktor Burakov and Dr. Aleksandr Bukanovsky to see what they were actually dealing with. The file with Kravchenko's name on it is still closed. The man who should have been on it is on a train, moving between cities, carrying his briefcase, watching the flat winter landscape pass through a window. He is unremarkable. He is invisible. He is, as far as the Soviet state is concerned, a citizen in good standing. This is the most dangerous thing about him. Not what he does in the forest, what he is everywhere else. Between September 1981 and September 1984, Chikatilo murdered at least 22 people, women and girls mostly, but not only. Among the dead were boys, young, transient, unattended boys, who had wandered into the wrong station at the wrong time, who had accepted help from a stranger who seemed to know where he was going. Igor Gudkov was 7 years old. Sergei Kuzmin was 15. Dmitry Ptashnikov was 10 and loved stamps, and went to a kiosk one afternoon to trade and never came back. We will spend time with each of them in part 3. For now, we leave part 2 here, at the moment when the investigation is still looking in the wrong direction, still operating on the assumption that the murderer is somewhere inside the social world of his victims, still without a profile, without a method, without the conceptual framework that would eventually allow Viktor Burakov and Dr. Aleksandr Bukanovsky to see what they were actually dealing with. The file with Kravchenko's name on it is still closed. The man who should have been on it is on a train, moving between cities, carrying his briefcase, watching the flat winter landscape pass through a window. He is unremarkable. He is invisible. He is, as far as the Soviet state is concerned, a citizen in good standing. This is the most dangerous thing about him. Not what he does in the forest, what he is everywhere else. In part 3, we will follow Viktor Burakov into the investigation, into the years of dead ends and false leads, the harassment of innocent people, the political obstacles, the mounting body count that the Soviet state refused to acknowledge publicly, while privately deploying hundreds of officers to find the man responsible. We will meet the children of 1982 and 1983. We will stand on the platforms where they were last seen. We will try to understand how a state that was watching, that had resources deployed, that had investigators who were not stupid, that had forensic capability, however limited, still could not find a man who was standing in plain sight. The answer to that question is the story of Part 3.